The night split open with a scream that seemed to claw through the air like broken glass. James lay frozen in his bed, sweat glistening on his forehead as his heart thumped like a war drum against his chest. The shadow pressed at the edges of his vision, coiling in the corners of the room like smoke given shape. James whispered, "Who's there?" But silence stretched like a noose, tightening with every heartbeat. The whisper returned, soft as dead leaves dragging across stone. James clutched the sheets, his breath shallow, his mind a whirlwind of terror. A figure began forming, taller than the doorway, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted as though it studied prey. His childhood terror clawed back from memory, forcing him into submission. The room felt colder, the air too thick to breathe. He wanted to run, to escape, but his body betrayed him, paralyzed by dread. The figure loomed closer, its shadow devouring light. James whispered again, "Please, stop," but darkness had already answered. James woke drenched in sweat, the scream echoing in his skull like a bell refusing to stop ringing. His eyes darted across the dark bedroom, searching for proof he was safe, but shadows mocked him with silent shapes. He rubbed his face with shaking hands, the whisper clinging to his ears, as if carried back from a world he was never meant to see. James muttered, "It was just a dream," but the words felt empty, like lies told to a frightened child. The clock on the wall read 3:3, its ticking loud enough to pierce the stillness. He tried to steady his breathing, yet each inhale dragged more dread into his lungs. The night outside was still, no wind, no sound, no comfort. He turned on the lamp, flooding the room with warm light, but the fear refused to leave. His body sat upright, but his mind remained trapped in the nightmare's grasp. The whisper lingered like smoke in James' ears, an echo that would not die even though silence filled the room. He stumbled to the mirror, his reflection fractured under trembling light, and his own eyes appeared foreign, darker, older, as if haunted by something unseen. James said softly, "It followed me," his voice breaking under the weight of the words. His shoulders sagged, and he clutched the dresser to keep from collapsing. He knew he had never spoken those words before, yet they carried truth heavy as stone. Outside, a tree branch scraped against the glass, and he flinched like a hunted animal. His reflection seemed delayed, a heartbeat slower, as though the mirror held another version of him. His pulse thundered, and he turned away before the reflection could do something he could not bear to watch. The room pressed down on him with suffocating silence, every corner heavy with menace. James returned to bed, but could not shake the certainty of being observed. His skin prickled as though unseen eyes carved into his back. James whispered, "Stop watching me," but no answer came. The shadows swayed slightly with no breeze to move them, like dancers bound by invisible strings. His chest ached with the effort of each breath, ribs trembling under the strain of fear. He reached for his phone, screen lighting his face, but no message, no call, only the time, 3:19. His hand shook so violently the phone slipped onto the blanket. James squeezed his eyes shut, forcing his body down, but sleep refused him. Behind his eyelids the shape returned, taller than walls, leaning closer, patient and merciless. James curled beneath the thin blanket, desperate for safety that fabric could never provide. The weight of silence became unbearable, a crushing reminder that he was no longer alone. He whispered to himself, "This isn't real," but the words carried no comfort, sounding like a stranger's voice. His chest heaved, sweat dampening the pillow beneath his head. The darkness in the corner thickened, no longer shadows, but a presence that consumed light itself. James buried his face deeper into the pillow, fighting to smother his panic, yet the whisper returned, brushing against his ear like icy breath. He flinched, biting his lip until he tasted copper. Every memory of childhood fear stormed back, reminding him that nightmares had always known his name. He lay paralyzed, trapped between dream and waking, as the dark waited patiently. The morning light slipped weakly through the blinds, but James felt no safety in the new day. His eyes darted across the apartment as shadows clung unnaturally to the walls, refusing to leave even under the touch of sunlight. He whispered, "It's not gone," the words brittle in the still air. The clock ticked louder than before, mocking his attempts to find calm. James shuffled to the kitchen, his footsteps heavy, but the corners of the room seemed alive, shifting like they carried breath. He leaned on the counter, fighting exhaustion that gnawed at his bones. A glass slipped from his shaking hands, shattering into fragments that seemed too sharp, too loud. He stared at the pieces, convinced they were rearranging into shapes that should not exist. His chest tightened as he realized the nightmare had not ended with sleep. Later that afternoon, James forced himself outside, his mind desperate for human presence. He met Daniel at a small cafe, sunlight washing through wide windows. James leaned forward, voice shaking as he said, "Daniel, something is following me, it's not in my head." Daniel frowned, pushing his coffee aside, his tone steady. "You're exhausted, James, it's stress." The words landed like stones, crushing the fragile hope that someone might believe him. James clenched his jaw, eyes burning with frustration. The hum of conversations around them felt distant, drowned by the sound of his racing heart. James tried again, whispering, "You don't understand, it's real." But Daniel only shook his head with cold certainty. The conversation dragged, James pleading while Daniel remained unmoved. James' hands trembled as he said, "Daniel, I can't sleep, it's here even when I wake." Daniel rubbed his temple, sighing, "You've been through worse, you need rest, not fear." James' voice cracked as he leaned closer, desperation leaking through every word. The cafe around them buzzed with laughter and clinking cups, but James heard only the silence between their sentences. Daniel's dismissal felt like betrayal, a wound cut deeper by calm reasoning. James gripped the edge of the table, nails scraping wood as his body shook. The shadows outside the window seemed to stretch longer than they should, sliding unnaturally toward the cafe glass. James' breath caught, eyes locked on the creeping darkness only he could see. That night, James sat alone in his apartment, lights burning in every room, yet the shadows twisted as though alive. The corner of his eye betrayed him with fleeting shapes, tall and unnatural. He muttered, "Stop hiding," though his voice wavered. The television flickered without sound, screen light stuttering across his pale face. His body tensed as he turned sharply, certain something shifted in the hallway. His breath grew ragged, filling the silence until it felt suffocating. The walls seemed to lean inward, pressing closer with each second. The figure appeared for a heartbeat in the glass reflection of the dark window, taller than the frame, faceless, waiting. James staggered backward, his chest heaving, his body trembling under the certainty he was no longer alone. James sat on the floor near the couch, his back pressed against it, hands clutching his knees as he rocked faintly. He whispered, "It followed me out," the words hollow, torn by fear. The air grew colder, his breath misting faintly under the ceiling light. The hum of electricity faltered, bulbs flickering, shadows deepening with each pulse of darkness. James dared to glance up, and there it was, the figure no longer confined to dream. Its body stretching across the living room wall like a parasite feeding on light. Its faceless head tilted, patient, cruel, acknowledging his fear as if savoring it. James pressed harder into the couch, unable to scream, unable to run. The realization striking him like a blade, he was being hunted in his waking world. James collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion dragging him into uneasy sleep. His body froze within minutes, eyes fluttering as if pinned open by unseen hands. He could not move, could not scream, and the weight of paralysis suffocated him. A shadow figure hovered near the foot of his bed, limbs curling like smoke, its faceless head dipping lower as if savoring his helplessness. James wanted to fight, but his muscles ignored every desperate command. The air pressed against his chest, crushing, heavy. His lips parted, but no sound escaped, only a shallow gasp. The figure leaned closer, whispering words he did not understand, syllables sharp as broken glass. James' heart hammered violently, each beat louder than thunder in his ears. He thought, for one fragile instant, that he might suffocate before morning arrived. The following day, James sat slumped over his desk at work, his face pale, his hands trembling as he typed. His thoughts scattered like broken shards, each one pierced by memories of the night. Colleagues passed by, their voices distant, blurred by the fog of his exhaustion. James muttered softly, "It won't let me rest," his words nearly lost under the hum of computers. His screen blurred as his eyes watered, the lines of text swimming and shifting into symbols he could not read. His boss called his name sharply, but James startled violently, heart pounding, as though pulled from a nightmare mid-scream. The weight of paranoia crushed him, the certainty that shadows moved even beneath fluorescent lights. James felt as though the world itself was betraying him, slipping into madness. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table, his head buried in his arms, when a faint whisper coiled into the silence. The voice carried words he did not know, yet their meaning clawed at his bones. He lifted his head, eyes darting across the room, and the whisper grew louder, dripping with malice. James whispered, "Leave me alone," but the voice laughed, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. His lights flickered, shadows stretched across walls, moving independent of their sources. James covered his ears, rocking as though he could force the sound out. But the words pierced deeper, slicing into his thoughts, filling every space with torment. He realized it was not just speaking to him, it was inside him, feeding on his fear like a starving beast. Later that night, James bolted upright, gasping, as a figure appeared near the doorway. It was not the shadow, but a translucent form of a young woman, eyes hollow, face twisted in sorrow. She raised a trembling hand, lips moving without sound. James whispered, "What happened to you?" His chest heaved as the apparition's eyes pleaded for him to listen. Her form flickered like static, her body trapped between worlds. She pointed toward the darkness gathering in the corner, before her figure broke apart into fragments of cold light. James staggered forward, reaching out, but his hand cut through nothing but air. His skin burned with the cold left behind, and he knew she was more than a hallucination. She was a victim bound to the same terror. James stumbled backward, shaking violently, his mind unraveling as fear consumed him. He pressed against the wall, muttering, "I can't trust what's real anymore." The air thickened, heavy with unseen weight, every breath tearing like glass. The furniture around him seemed to tilt, stretching as though bending to unseen rules. He covered his face, refusing to look, yet shadows moved even across closed eyelids. The room whispered with voices not his own, laughter mixed with screams. James' sanity cracked like porcelain under pressure, the world no longer obeying reason. He slid down to the floor, his nails scraping the paint of the wall. A sob tore from his chest, sharp and broken. He realized with terror that reality was no longer his to trust. James wandered through the quiet library, his mind fraying under the weight of unanswered questions. Rows of forgotten books towered over him like silent judges. His body shook as whispers from his nightmares echoed faintly between the shelves. A voice broke the silence, calm yet piercing. "You've seen him, haven't you?" James spun around, startled to find Evelyn watching him, her gaze heavy with secrets. James stammered, "You know about the shadow?" His words trembled with equal parts fear and relief. Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "He's been hunting longer than you imagine," she said, her tone flat, deliberate. James felt his chest tighten, realization digging into him like claws. His dread deepened, but her presence promised answers he both feared and craved. James sat opposite Evelyn, at a heavy oak table, his hands trembling as she slid an ancient book toward him. "Your family carries his mark," Evelyn said, her voice low. James whispered, "That's not possible." His eyes scanned faded pages filled with symbols he could not understand, yet they stirred a sickening familiarity. Evelyn leaned closer, her voice sharp as broken glass. "The shadow is bound to bloodlines, and yours is cursed." James shook his head, rejecting the words even as the truth pressed down. The library lights flickered, shadows rippling across the walls as though listening. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her tone grave. "You can't outrun him. He feeds on what your family left behind. James pressed his palms into the table, fighting the urge to collapse beneath the revelation. James slammed the book shut, his voice rising. You're wrong, this isn't real. Evelyn remained unmoved, her gaze steady, unshaken. You've already seen him outside your dreams, she said, her tone quiet but unyielding. James' breathing turned ragged as denial battled with memories that refused to fade. His body trembled, fingers clawing at the table. Evelyn's expression softened only slightly, her voice laced with warning. You can lie to yourself, but he will not stop. James' eyes burned with frustration as he snapped. Then why me? Evelyn paused, her silence heavier than words. Finally, she said, because you were chosen long before you were born. The words sank into him like cold iron, stripping away the fragile walls he had built to contain his fear. The room seemed colder as Evelyn stood, pacing slowly between the towering shelves. You can't kill him, she said, her voice echoing in the still air. James' voice cracked. Then what do I do? Evelyn stopped, her back to him, before answering with deliberate calm. You resist. You endure. That is survival. James' chest heaved, anger mixing with despair. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound sharp, jarring. That's not enough, he growled, his words broken. Evelyn turned, her eyes shadowed with sadness. It's all anyone has ever managed. The library seemed to darken, lights dimming as though the shadow itself drew closer. James' fear deepened, but beneath it, a flicker of defiance ignited, thin but alive. Evelyn sat back down, her voice low, almost a whisper. The shadow grows stronger the more you deny it. James' body stiffened, his voice shaking. You think I wanted this? Evelyn tilted her head, her eyes unreadable. Your past, your childhood holds the key, she said, the words carrying a cryptic weight. James froze, flashes of old memories clawing their way forward, memories of nights he had buried, of screams he had convinced himself were dreams. He swallowed hard, muttering, It started before I can remember. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her tone final. Then it will end only when you face it. James leaned back in his chair, heart pounding, dread and fragile resolve colliding inside him. The silence of the library felt heavier than stone. James walked through the abandoned street, night air sharp against his skin, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. The shadow trailed close, its form slipping across walls like liquid night. James' breath trembled, eyes darting at every corner where darkness pooled. A single flickering street lamp hummed above, its light failing to keep the figure at bay. James muttered into the emptiness, words breaking under weight. This ends tonight. His chest pounded, but his jaw tightened with defiance. The world around him seemed hollow, streets too empty, silence too complete, as if the city itself waited for the outcome. The shadow grew taller, stretching as though feeding on his fear, yet James' resolve sparked like fragile fire against the suffocating dark. James reached the old church at the street's end, its doors half broken, stained glass shattered into jagged fragments. Inside, candles flickered faintly, casting uneven light across ruined pews. The air pressed heavy with memory, whispers threading through the silence like voices that did not belong. James moved slowly, steps uneven, his body heavy with exhaustion and fear. He whispered, This place knows him, the sound trembling through hollow air. The shadow seeped across the floor, stretching toward the altar, its presence thick and suffocating. James' chest heaved, sweat trickling down his temple as he gripped the wooden pew for balance. The world around him pulsed with menace, as if walls themselves leaned closer to listen. James fell to his knees before the altar, words choking in his throat as the shadow towered above. His body shook violently, yet his gaze locked upward, refusing surrender. Memories tore through him, nights of childhood screams, whispers that haunted his sleep, the truth Evelyn had forced upon him. He gasped, You've always been here, voice raw, carrying both terror and defiance. The shadow leaned closer, its faceless head tilting with cruel patience. Darkness rippled outward, swallowing what little light the candles offered. James pressed his palms to the ground, nails scraping wood, breath shallow, body trembling but spirit refusing to collapse. The silence bent, as if waiting for him to break, but James' whisper carved through it, fragile yet unyielding. The shadow swelled until walls cracked under its weight, yet James pushed to his feet, voice shaking but louder than before. "You cannot take me," he said, his chest heaving with every syllable. The darkness surged forward, tendrils snapping like whips of smoke, but James stood unmoving, body rigid with defiance. His breath came ragged, yet a fire lit behind his exhausted eyes. The ground trembled as pews splintered, light fading to nothing but the faint glow of flame. James's voice rose again, words raw with desperation and resolve. "I will not be yours." For a heartbeat, the shadow hesitated, its form wavering, as though recognition pierced its endless hunger. James staggered, but did not collapse, standing against what had haunted his bloodline. The silence cracked as dawn's light broke through shattered glass, thin rays spilling across the ruined church. James's body shook, his knees threatening collapse, but he remained standing. The shadow reeled backward, its form unraveling like smoke caught in wind, shrinking against the rising sun. James gasped, chest burning, his eyes locked on the retreating figure. He whispered, "You are not endless," voice breaking but carrying truth. The air grew lighter, the crushing weight lifting as the shadow dissolved into fragments of night. James dropped to the ground, body trembling with exhaustion, yet his face carried fragile resolve. The nightmare had not ended, but for the first time, it had retreated. The battle was unfinished, but James had endured until light returned. James walked through the ruins of the church as morning stretched across the broken glass, but no comfort touched his spirit. The silence clung too thick, as though waiting for his next breath to falter. His steps echoed, heavy and uneven, carrying both exhaustion and dread. He whispered into the still air, "It will come again," his voice shaking with fragile defiance. The walls seemed to breathe, shadows coiling faintly where light should have held. James pressed his hand against the cracked altar, his body trembling, yet his jaw clenched with stubborn resolve. His chest heaved as fragments of the night pressed like iron into memory. The truth weighed on him, but defiance burned, thin as flame yet refusing to die. James returned to his apartment, body heavy as if carrying stones. The morning sun pushed through blinds, but corners of the room swayed with unnatural weight. He sank into the couch, muttering, "Light does not banish him." His hands shook as he clutched his knees, face pale and drenched in sweat. The hum of the refrigerator flickered, lights dimming as shadows thickened, curling upward across the walls. James' chest rose with frantic gasps, his breath clouding in air that had grown too cold. His body folded in despair, yet his gaze lifted with the stubborn fire that refused to fade. The silence bent around him, heavy as chains, as if the room itself became a prison for his resolve. Later, James walked through the crowded street, his shoulders hunched as voices blurred into meaningless echoes. The warmth of daylight surrounded others, but shadows seemed to cling to him alone. His eyes darted to each reflection in glass windows, searching for the figure that never stayed hidden. He whispered through trembling lips, "You follow still," as though the words might call it forward. Pedestrians brushed past without seeing his torment, their laughter twisting into mockery in his ears. James staggered near a shop front, pressing his hand against cold glass. Reflection warped, his face fractured into fragments. Behind him, the outline flickered, tall and unnatural, unseen by all but him. That evening, James sat across from Evelyn in the dim corner of the library, his voice trembling as he said, "The light cannot hold him." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her tone sharp yet sorrowful. The light never could. The air between them thickened with unspoken weight, shelves looming like silent watchers. James' hand trembled as he clutched the old book Evelyn had given him, its pages filled with symbols that pulsed with meaning. His voice cracked, "He will consume me." Evelyn's gaze remained steady, words deliberate, "Only if you allow despair to win." James' body sagged, but his fists clenched tighter. Shadows rippled across the walls, listening. James stood outside as midnight settled, the sky thick with clouds swallowing the moon. His breath fogged, each exhale sharp as knives in frozen air. The street was empty, silence too perfect, waiting. He whispered, "You want me here?" His voice strained but steady. The figure appeared at the far end, towering, limbs stretched beyond natural form, head tilted as though mocking him. James' heart thundered, but he stood unyielding, body rigid despite tremors. The darkness advanced, devouring light from every lamp, leaving only cold void in its wake. James raised his chin, whisper breaking the silence, "I will not bow." The night itself seemed to tighten, their battle set in unspoken challenge. James stood in the deserted street as midnight deepened, the air so cold it burned with every breath. The faceless shadow towered before him, limbs twisted and endless, waiting with patient cruelty. James' chest heaved, sweat freezing against his skin, yet his gaze never faltered. He whispered, "This is where it ends," the words trembling, but heavy with truth. The silence thickened, broken only by the faint hum of broken lamps flickering above. Darkness rolled outward from the figure, swallowing road and sky alike. James clenched his fists, body shaking yet rooted as if the earth itself bound him. For the first time, fear and defiance burned together, giving him strength to stand. The shadow surged forward, darkness stretching like claws across the pavement. James staggered back, his breath torn ragged, but his voice rose stronger than before. "You will not take me." The air snapped with force as lights shattered above, glass raining like falling stars. James shielded his face, yet his eyes never left the shifting figure. His heart thundered like drums of war, each beat louder than silence. The ground trembled beneath his feet, cracks splitting the pavement, as if the world itself strained against the weight of the creature. James felt his body falter, but a spark of defiance carried him, a fire too fragile to extinguish. James collapsed to his knees, chest heaving as the shadow loomed above. Taller than buildings, its faceless head tilting in cruel amusement. He pressed his hands against the ground, nails scraping across the cold asphalt, body trembling yet refusing surrender. His whisper broke through the suffocating air, "You feed on fear, but I will starve you." The shadow faltered, its form rippling, as though struck by an unseen force. James' heart raced, strength returning in fragments with every word. The silence cracked with a low hum, as if the world itself had heard his defiance. James lifted his head, eyes burning with fragile fire, daring the darkness to strike again. The faceless shadow recoiled, its limbs twisting violently as if resisting unseen chains. James pushed to his feet, staggering but unbroken, his voice raw and unyielding. "You cannot own me." The air pulsed with force, every lamp exploding in a storm of sparks. Darkness surged, but James stood unmoving, his eyes locked forward. The ground shook as buildings groaned, shadows peeling from walls like burning paper. His body ached with exhaustion, yet defiance anchored him against the chaos. For the first time, the figure wavered, its form shrinking, retreating against the defiance it could not consume. James' breath came sharp and broken, yet his spirit blazed brighter than the night. Dawn crept across the horizon, light scattering through broken clouds, washing the street in pale gold. James collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, his body trembling under the weight of battle. The faceless shadow retreated into the thinning dark, dissolving into fragments carried by the rising sun. James whispered, "You are not endless," the words carrying both victory and exhaustion. The silence lifted, air warming as the weight of despair cracked and faded. James' face glistened with sweat and tears, his eyes locked on the horizon, fragile but alive. He understood the war was not over, but he had endured this night. For the first time the shadow had fled,